Good morning. My name is Dave Michels, and for the next 25 minutes or so, I'm going to be talking to you about this notion of sovereign cloud, definitions, drivers, and solutions. But first, let me introduce myself. As I said, my name is Dave, and I'm a researcher with the Cloud Legal Project at Queen Mary University of London, where for the past 8 years or so, I've been exploring the legal implications of using and providing cloud services. Now, our research is funded by Microsoft, and I've recently also received some funding from Broadcom to explore this concept of sovereign cloud. I also teach cloud computing law both at Queen Mary University and at the London School of Economics. And before academia, I had a real job. I used to work for Ofcom, the telecommunications regulator in the UK, and before that I worked for the United Nations in The Hague. But I hasten to add that I'm here speaking today in a personal capacity as an independent academic, and the views I express here today do not necessarily reflect those of any of my employers or of our research funders. Okay, so what I'm talking to you about today are really the findings of the research which I conducted together with Professors Christopher Millard and Ian Walden at Queen Mary, as well as the insights that I gained from interviewing a series of experts in preparation for the report which I published in February of this year, which was commissioned by Broadcom. But before we get into those findings, let's set the scene a little bit, right? Let's look a little bit at the market context and why that raises sovereignty concerns. So, if we look at the global cloud infrastructure market, what we see is that this is a very concentrated market. Right? The top 3 providers, Amazon Web Services, or AWS, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud, together hold some 63% of the infrastructure market. And they're also referred to as the hyperscalers. When we go down that list of the top 8 providers, we see that those are all either US or Chinese companies. Right? There is no single European cloud provider in the top 8. And what's true of the global infrastructure market is also largely true of European cloud markets. If we look at the top 6 leaders in provision of cloud services in Europe, we'll see that the top 3 spaces are almost always occupied by Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, with the exception of France, where OVH is in the 3rd space. And if we look at this table, we'll see that there are a handful of European providers, but their share has been steadily decreasing over time. So if we look at data from the start of 2017 to about mid-2022, we can see that the overall market has grown, right, from around 2 billion euros to around 10 billion euros. But at that same time, the European providers' share of that market has decreased from over 25% to just under 15%. In other words, what we're seeing is widespread reliance on foreign and particularly US service providers. Right? And this has led to concerns both on behalf of individual customers and European policymakers. And it's those concerns that I'm here to talk to you about today. Now, in our research, we really identified 2 key underlying concerns. The first is about the confidentiality of European customer data, and the second is about the availability of European services, or services to European customers. So what do I mean by that? Well, when I'm talking about the confidentiality of data, I mean to say, will your cloud provider hand over your customer data to the US government without informing you? Right? Because the US government can order them to hand over customer data either for law enforcement purposes under the Stored Communications Act, as amended by the Cloud Act, or in order to obtain foreign intelligence under FISA Section 702. And in both those cases, US production orders can target data stored in Europe. So merely having data stored at data centers within Europe does not protect your data from US government access if the cloud provider is subject to US jurisdiction. So that's the first concern around confidentiality. The second concern is different. It's about availability. And the question here is, can the US government order your cloud provider to stop providing services to you? right? This is sometimes also referred to as the choke point effect, right? It's when a government exercises control over a private actor and orders them to stop providing services or products to a certain market to further that government's political goals. And we've seen this in other sectors, right? We've seen the US and the EU cut Iran off from the SWIFT bank messaging service in response to its nuclear program. And we've also seen Russia decrease its gas supplies to Europe following the invasion of Ukraine. Now you might say, sure, Iran, Russia, those are adversaries, right? But with the US, we have a long-standing NATO partnership. They are our allies. It's a very low likelihood that they would cut us off from the US cloud. And I'd probably agree with you, although who knows, right? What I will say for certain is that it would be very high impact, right? It would be extremely disruptive if US cloud service providers stopped serving European customers in the public sector or in the critical infrastructure sectors, right? That would have a huge impact on European society. So those are the two key concerns around confidentiality and availability. Now, I will add that these concerns are not new, right? There have been concerns about our reliance on foreign IT services since at least the 1970s, and concerns about US government access and US surveillance were highlighted by the Snowden revelations some 10 years ago. But there is, I would say, a renewed emphasis on these sovereignty issues, and part of that has to do with the second Trump administration. So I'll just highlight one example, which is the sanctions on ICC prosecutor Karim Khan. So in February of this year, the Trump administration imposed sanctions on Karim Khan, the prosecutor at the International Criminal Court, who had opened investigations into Israel's conduct in Gaza and the US conduct in Afghanistan. And as part of those sanctions, companies, institutions, and individuals cannot provide Karim Khan with financial, material, or technological support, right? And so 2 weeks ago, the Associated Press reported that as a result, Microsoft stopped providing Karim Khan with an email service, right? They canceled, they withdrew his Outlook account, and as a result, he can no longer access that service. Now, this is a developing story, and there's a lot that's not entirely clear about exactly what's happened here. But I will say that it illustrates the potential for the US government to weaponize our dependence on US cloud services to further their geopolitical goals, which might not always align with European interests. Okay. So, what am I going to cover today? We're going to talk a little bit about what a sovereign cloud is, how we might go about defining that concept. We'll look a little bit about what drives demand for European sovereign services, and then we'll look at potential solutions in this space. So how can we protect European data stored in the cloud? So let's start there. What is a sovereign cloud? I think if you want to understand the concept of sovereign cloud, we have to see it as a response to existing power imbalances, right? Sovereign cloud is all about empowering European customers and protecting European data. In my research, I've come across 3 related and overlapping definitions of a sovereign cloud, which we'll talk about now. The first is a broad notion of sovereign cloud as related to customer autonomy. The second focuses more specifically on the issue of foreign government control, while the third deals with the objective of strategic autonomy. So let's unpack what each of those terms mean. We're talking about customer autonomy. We're talking about a broad understanding of sovereign cloud that is all about empowering customers to make informed choices about the IT resources that they use, and making sure that customers can exercise control over the cloud resources they use. And that includes things like being able to determine where their data are stored, who can access and use the data they store in the cloud, and what metadata a provider collects about the customer's use of the cloud. Customer autonomy is also related to issues of vendor lock-in. Right? There are long-standing concerns in cloud markets about customers' ability to leave their cloud provider if they are not satisfied with some element of the service. And that has to do with issues of portability, both of data and applications, as well as interoperability, right? The ability to use different cloud services from different providers in a joined-up way. In other words, what we're talking about here is addressing the existing power imbalance between cloud customers and cloud providers in a very broad sense. Now, when we're talking about foreign government control more specifically, we can also use the term sovereign cloud to have a narrower focus. Here, the question is, can a foreign government exercise effective jurisdiction over your cloud provider, giving rise to those two key concerns we saw before? Can they order your cloud provider to hand over your data? And does Donald Trump have a big red button he can push to cut you off from your cloud service? In this sense, sovereign cloud is about addressing the power imbalance between a cloud customer and a foreign government that can exercise control over your cloud provider. Now, the last concern has to do with European strategic autonomy, right? And this is something different again. When we're talking about strategic autonomy, we're talking about Europe's ability to act independently on the world stage, right? We're talking about the ability of the European Union and its member states to chart their own course in international affairs, free from undue outside interference. And the concern here is that our widespread reliance on US providers, coupled with the US government's ability to exercise control over those providers, limits European strategic autonomy. Now, this boils down really to those same two key concerns around confidentiality and availability. But here the question is not about the impact on a specific customer, but rather, what does it mean for us as a whole, as a society, when we rely to this extent on US service providers? And the concern is that the US government is better able to access information because it can obtain customer data stored in the cloud. And that gives it an information advantage when conducting foreign affairs. The other concern is that the US can threaten to cut us off from US cloud services, and in that manner exercise influence over the EU and its member states, and have them act in the US interests rather than in European interests. So in other words, here we're using the term sovereign cloud to address this power imbalance between the EU and member states on the one hand, and the US government on the other. So those, I think, are the three ways in which this term is typically used, right? Customer autonomy, broadly, foreign government control specifically, in questions about European strategic autonomy. And although they differ slightly, I do think they share a core of common objectives, right? Which is to empower European customers, to protect European data from foreign government control, and to strengthen, ultimately, Europe's strategic autonomy. So I think a sovereign cloud service is one that helps us meet those objectives. And that's how I would define a sovereign cloud. Let's look then at some of the drivers that underlie demand for sovereign cloud. Why are customers interested in this topic today? And so when I went and spoke to different European cloud providers and asked them, what are your customers looking for? What do they ask you and what are they hoping to achieve? The key thing that I learned was that drivers differ between customers, depending typically on the sector in which they operate and the type of data that they're looking to process in the cloud. And in my research, I identified two types of drivers. Some organizations have what we might call internal drivers, and some are more focused on external drivers. So when we talk about internal drivers, we mean drivers related to an organization's own internal objectives, right? Its own operational or commercial needs to safeguard their data from foreign government control, including preventing US government access. Right? Now, an obvious example of that would be organizations in the defense or intelligence sector, where they're dealing with information that is relevant to national security, right? That is both of interest, potentially, to US foreign intelligence, and very much in European interest to safeguard and prevent such access. But it also applies more broadly to organizations working on strategic research and development, right? So here we might think about European universities, or European startups working in areas such as advanced encryption, quantum computing, or AI. Right? In those cases, they would also want to safeguard that information from US government access, and US intelligence agencies may well want to see what they're up to. So in all of those cases, what we have is a strong internal driver towards the use of a more sovereign cloud solution. Now, external drivers are slightly different. And an external driver is an outside factor that incentivizes a company to seek a sovereign cloud solution. And typically, the most prominent external driver we came across was regulation. And most often, that is in the form of data protection regulation, or the GDPR. Right? Under the GDPR, European organizations have an obligation to protect the confidentiality of the personal data which they process. Right? And that includes protecting personal data from unauthorized access by foreign governments. European organizations also have a duty to only use cloud providers as processors if those providers can offer sufficient guarantees that they will comply with the GDPR. And so this raises questions whether you, as a European organization, can use a US cloud provider that is subject to US jurisdiction and so may need to hand over personal data to the US government. Now, this is a complicated legal issue, which I don't want to get into in detail here today. But I will say that one relevant factor is whether you are processing sensitive data in the cloud. Right? And we can think then of what's called special category data, things like health or genetics or biometrics, children's data, or other categories of more private data, such as financial and location data. Right? In all of those cases, I would say that the more sensitive the data that you process in the cloud, the more of an obligation you have as an organization to ensure that you've put in place appropriate protection of that personal data against foreign government access. So in those sectors that process a lot of sensitive data, there are real compliance concerns about using US cloud providers under the GDPR. And that is an external driver that can drive some organizations to seek out more sovereign cloud solutions. Okay, for the final part of the presentation then, let's start looking at some solutions, right? What can we actually do to protect European data in the cloud? And what I think we're seeing at the moment in the market is really a range of different solutions being offered and adopted. I think it's helpful, for myself at least, to separate these into 4 broad categories. Now, the first category is simply to forego the use of a cloud service, right? To stick with your in-house IT. And that gives you a really high degree of autonomy over your own computer resources because you get to deploy them, right? And you decide how they work. And if a government wants access, they have to come to you. But of course, at the same time, you lose all the advantages that cloud deployments can offer, right? You lose the flexibility, the rapid scalability, and the ability to rely on a specialized provider of these services. And so instead, it's up to you as an organization to ensure that you can deploy and maintain secure systems yourself. And that's not going to be a solution for everyone. Alternatively, you could use a cloud service, but opt for a European cloud. Right? And the simplest solution there would be to use the service of one of the existing European cloud providers, like OVH or Deutsche Telekom. A more ambitious plan would be to create what's sometimes called a federated European cloud. Right? So that would pool together the resources of different European cloud providers to create a single service based on seamless interoperability between the different parts and operate at a scale that can then compete with the US hyperscalers. The one thing I would note when using a European cloud provider as a caveat is that being European does not mean a company is necessarily immune to US jurisdiction. Right? European companies can also be subject to US jurisdiction, and especially if they have customers, assets, and employees in the US. So it's not as simple as saying, oh, this company is based in Berlin or in Paris, and so it's sovereign. There's more to US jurisdiction than that. The third broad category is what I think of as EU plus US cloud services, so that combine some components from Europe and some components from the US. And a typical example here would be a partnership model, right, wherein a European company operates the underlying infrastructure while a US company offers the software that runs within that infrastructure. And so we see examples of this in France with Bleu, which is a partnership between Microsoft and Orange, and in Germany with Delos, which is a partnership between Microsoft, Arvato, and SAP. And so what this does is it allows European customers to benefit from US software, but that software is deployed in an isolated way, such that the US company cannot access European customer data. And thereby, this kind of model can prevent US government access. The fourth model then is what I like to call hyperscaler plus, right? So this essentially means continuing to use one of the US hyperscaler services, but with additional measures in place to protect against foreign government control. So Brad Smith of Microsoft was here in Brussels at the end of April, announcing Microsoft's new commitments to European digital sovereignty. Google, some 2 weeks ago on their blog, launched similar commitments, and AWS also has a sovereignty program for European customers, right? And this is essentially the hyperscalers responding to these concerns around cloud sovereignty. And what they're doing is they are putting in place measures that go beyond merely storing data in Europe, right? They're adding organizational measures, things like having a separate subsidiary with a European board of directors, as well as technical measures, including advanced encryption solutions. The idea being that if the cloud provider cannot access the data in the clear, then they cannot hand that data over to the US government in the clear either. So I would say, broadly speaking, that's the range of solutions that we have, and those exist somewhere on a spectrum of sovereignty, with in-house IT offering the most complete version of sovereignty, and all of the other models offering some form of conditional sovereignty. That is, it will protect from foreign government control under certain conditions. Now, the tricky thing, of course, then, is what do we do, right? Which of these solutions is appropriate for which set of circumstances? And I would argue that that really can only be decided on a case-by-case basis because customer sovereignty needs differ. But I will say there are two factors that are generally relevant when we're talking about evaluating sovereign solutions. The first is desirability. So does this help an organization meet its sovereignty needs? And in particular, does it reduce those risks from foreign government control that we've been talking about today? And the second is viability, right? Is this a solution that we're able to deploy at relatively short term and with a reasonable cost? And those factors will differ per organization, depending on their sovereignty needs, as well as the workload that they're trying to place in the cloud. As a result, there can be no one-size-fits-all solutions. Instead, what we need is active risk management by European organizations. If you are choosing to use a cloud service, you need to carefully consider any risks that stem from foreign government control and what you can do to mitigate those risks. And where that use takes place within a regulated environment, those risk management decisions need to be overseen by European regulators. Okay, what are your take-home messages? I would say, although we have these different definitions of sovereign cloud, they focus on similar underlying concerns, and we're aiming to achieve similar objectives about empowering European customers and protecting European data from foreign government control. The second is that customer sovereignty needs differ per organization, depending on the sector and the type of data that they're processing. And the third and final one is that different cloud providers offer different solutions. We have some Europe-only solutions, we have some EU and US partnerships, and we have some US hyperscaler models that add additional measures to protect European data. And which option is best for your set of needs depends on, as I said, your sovereignty needs and what you're looking to achieve. And so what we need is European organizations to engage in active risk management. Okay, just in closing, I've also been asked to look ahead a little bit at what is coming in the future. In your future is a series of panels that will cover things like AI, right? And that does seem to be a very hot topic, and it does raise some of the same sovereign concerns that we talked about in relation to cloud services, right? The same concern about confidentiality arises. Will OpenAI disclose to the US government all of the questions you have asked ChatGPT? And as we come to rely on these AI assistants for more and more of our tasks, is there a risk that a foreign government may decide to cut us off from the AI services? But with a new technology, there are also new risks, right? AI models do more than just store and process information. They also generate new outputs, right? And there might be a concern that a foreign government would exercise control over a foreign provider to skew those outputs in a certain direction, right? A direction that suits their interests rather than those of European societies. These are big ideas for further discussion and future research, but I just wanted to leave you with that thought about the future. If you're interested in the stuff I've discussed today, we do have our academic papers up on SSRN that have a lot more detail on the things we've covered. And then all that remains for me to do is to thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to hearing your questions.